that the Sustainable Development Goals actually represent a benchmark for national development. So it's actually an idealized representation of what a national development process or a system would be. And it gives definite boundaries in order to give a complete coverage of what a development process would look like. And it does this by going through essential functions of the major components of the national development process. And what I would like to note here is that climate change has to be considered probably at a higher level than the other SDGs, as you all might know that it influences almost all or most of the SDGs directly or indirectly. Sorry, this is very, very sensitive. Okay, I would like to bring attention again to the 17 goals, and this time more so specifically looking at the extended goal in itself. For example, if you look at goal 2, the shorter version is zero hunger, but I think in order not to lose the essence of each of the goals, we need to look at the extended goal. For example, the goal 2 would actually be ending hunger, achieving food security, improving nutrition, and promoting sustainable agriculture. So when you read the entire goal, you get the gist of what is actually intended for each of these goals rather than looking at the shorter version of the goals. So this gives us more focus on what we actually need to achieve. This has already been said by the previous speaker, that the goals of the SDG 13 on climate change resonates that of the goals of the NAP, which is basically to reduce vulnerability by building adaptive capacity and resilience, and to facilitate the integration of climate change adaptation into the policies, plans, programs, and more specifically into the development planning processes. But I would also like to note here that the Article 7 of the Paris Agreement on the Global Goal on Adaptation also links to the goals of NAPs, which is enhancing adaptive capacity and strengthening resilience and reducing vulnerability. But more importantly, it also relates to sustainable development and the global temperature limit of less than 2-degree goal. So having said that, the main conclusion, which is most of the time very obvious, but yet largely ignored, is the fact that, sorry, I think I missed one more slide before that. Yeah, so before I get into that conclusion that I made, this was produced by David LeBlanc, who worked for the UN Department in Economic and Social Affairs. So this diagram here is actually a lot simpler than it looks. What he was trying to get at was, he drew out the main SDG goals, the 17 goals in these larger circles, and then came up with the targets for each of these goals in the smaller circles. And then what he went on to do was to see how the targets of these specific SDG goals also linked to other SDG goals. And you can see that there's a lot of linkages from one specific goal to a lot of SDG, one specific target to a lot of SDG goals. So the key message here was that a lot of things are interdependent and interconnected. So the main conclusion, as I was saying earlier, is that since due to this integrated nature of issues, we cannot work in the silo or single focus approach or the sectoral approach. And just to reiterate myself, I was saying how climate change is usually the issue or the driver or the factor that affects many of the SDGs directly or indirectly, which is why we need to consider both of them together. And also, as mentioned by the earlier speaker, the SDG targets had come on before the Paris Agreement. So once the Paris Agreement was actually in force, in addition to the SDG targets on climate change, there are also newer targets that have come out of the Paris Agreement that I think is very important for all of us to keep in mind and consider. So now moving on to the actual NAP SDG iframe, what we actually do is identify the SDGs that are sensitive to climate change directly, And I think if you look at the list, you would come up with 6 to 9 SDGs, which should include, of course, hunger, water, ecosystem health, energy, and several other SDGs. And then there are specific targets. I think she said there were some 168 targets in total. So for each of these targets, what we want to do is categorize them into 3 broad categories, depending on their relationship with climate change adaptation. So you would have a high-level co-objective, which is compared to the global goal on adaptation and the objectives of the NAPs. Then you would have more quantifiable targets, which are more specific. And then you would have targets that are more of guiding principles, which are generally more difficult to quantify. So once you have categorized these targets, the next step is actually to specifically focus on the second category of the targets, which are quantifiable in nature. So we would consider the measurable and specific targets for the main development themes. For example, you would have food security or water resources. And then you would add on to that the national development goals, what each of your country's needs and goals and targets, to create a country-specific list of goals and targets. And then you would also add other additional targets from frameworks such as the Sendai framework or other relevant frameworks that your countries may be party to. And then we work with these development teams to identify relevant systems which need to be assessed further for coming up with adaptation actions. And you would then be able to measure both development and adaptation outputs, results and impacts, and will be able to conduct the monitoring evaluation for both adaptation and development. So just to again explain what I just said in my earlier slide, you would be able to characterize the development context and then come up with, map that with climate change, SDGs, your national goals, your regional frameworks and targets, and then identify systems for each of these targets, each of these themes, and then come up with assessments of these systems with, to come up with various adaptation options, which would need to be then appraised, costed, and ranked. And then ultimately you would come up with a list whereby you'd have to look at trade-offs and synergies before finally compiling the adaptation priorities. I know it sounds a lot more complex, so I will come up with the example to just make it a lot more clearer. So this is the example that I've prepared. So what you do is, in order to identify and characterize the different development themes, you would look at the policy goals, as I mentioned. You would look at your climate change adaptation targets, your national development goals, SDGs, Paris Agreement, and basically all the targets and targets that a particular country would have, and then come up with the various development themes. For this example, I've come up with 3 development themes, which are food security, livelihoods and poverty, and water resources. Then for each of these development themes, you would actually come up with specific systems. So for food security, you would have one system on crop production and another system on strategic national reserves. So then you would already see that there's a linkage between the crop production would contribute to both food security and livelihoods. And similarly for the urban water system, you would know that it would be competing with the water for irrigation hydropower systems. So basically, again, here you're talking about the integrative nature and how things are correlated to one another. And ultimately, you would have to come up with a list of outcomes which would take into consideration both development and adaptation. And you would have to do a lot of assessments in order to do the trade-offs and synergy to come up with your priority list. So in conclusion, what we're saying is that using the NAP SDGI frame, it would be more possible to look at issues as systems, because they're all interconnected and interrelated, and that probably gives you a holistic picture. Since it gives a holistic approach for adaptation planning and implementation, it ensures that it considers all the driving factors, the key players, and the stakeholders. Thereby, you can avoid these silo or sectoral approaches. Thank you for your attention.